The airport terminal was alive with a familiar symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and the quiet murmurs of travelers speaking languages that spanned continents. Dr. Amara Sullivan adjusted the strap of her well-worn leather tote bag and exhaled softly as she approached the boarding gate. Geneva awaited her. Another conference, another chance to present her groundbreaking research on global health disparities. But she knew better than to expect the journey would pass without incident. She had been here before, not in this exact place, but in spaces like it. Airports, hotel lobbies, boardrooms. Places where glances lingered too long, questions hovered beneath polite words, and invisible walls formed between herself and those who couldn't quite place her. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, and Amara joined the line for first-class passengers. A man ahead of her, middle-aged with silver hair and a watch that could pay rent for half a year, glanced over his shoulder. His eyes flicked down to her outfit. Simple, understated, professional, yet far from the fine tailoring he was wrapped in. His gaze didn't linger, but she caught the slight furrow of his brow before he turned away. Amara was used to this. She had long learned that wealth, status, and achievement didn't always announce themselves in the forms people expected. Her wealth lay in her quiet resilience, in the miles of sacrifice behind her. Her status was sewn into the pages of research journals and the lives saved by her work. "Good afternoon, welcome aboard." The gate agent greeted him with a bright, rehearsed smile. Amara stepped forward, ticket in hand. "First class, row 2A," she said calmly. The agent's gaze hesitated for just a breath too long, barely perceptible, but there. "Right this way," the agent said, gesturing toward the jet bridge, her smile dimming ever so slightly. Amara offered a polite nod and proceeded. The first-class cabin was quiet, cloaked in the fragrance of citrus and leather. Passengers sipped champagne as they stowed their bags. Amara made her way down the aisle, counting the rows. "Excuse me," a voice sliced through the calm. Amara stopped. A flight attendant stood in front of her, blonde hair tightly pulled back. Her eyes narrowing in the way people's eyes did when they were trying to remain polite but couldn't hide what lived behind them. Her name tag read Rachel. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" Rachel's tone was dipped in saccharine sweetness, but Amara recognized the taste beneath it, the metallic edge of disbelief. "Yes," Amara replied, holding up her ticket. "Row 2A." Rachel leaned in slightly, as if proximity might reveal some flaw in Amara's story, some mistake in the system. The laminated card in Amara's hand was inspected briefly before Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well," Rachel said, stepping aside with a kind of flourish that suggested Amara was a guest overstaying her welcome. Amara moved past her, shoulders straight, ignoring the prickling weight of eyes on her back. But it was never just one look, was it? She found her seat by the window, tucked her bag beneath it, and settled in. The leather was cool beneath her palms as she ran her hand along the armrest. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched endlessly, the late afternoon sun staining it gold. Rachel's voice returned, softer now but no less pointed. Amara didn't turn to see who she was speaking to, but the words carried easily across the small cabin. "I just don't understand how some people afford this," Rachel whispered. Amara stared at the clouds, her hands folding gently in her lap. It wasn't that she hadn't heard worse. No, life had ensured she was fluent in these quiet humiliations. But it was the consistency of it, the way it threaded itself into places that should have been insulated from ignorance. Across the aisle, a businessman with a copy of the Wall Street Journal briefly lowered his paper, his eyes meeting hers just for a moment before he returned to his reading, his brow tightening in disapproval. That was the thing about silence, it was rarely neutral. Minutes passed. The plane filled, and the overhead compartments shut with soft thuds. Rachel passed by again, this time pushing the beverage cart. Her movements were precise and mechanical. She poured champagne for the businessman, smiled warmly at a young couple a few rows back, and when she reached Amara, her demeanor shifted. "Would you like something to drink?" Amara glanced up. "Water, please." Rachel's brow arched as if amused. "Just water." "Yes," Amara replied, her voice calm. A glass appeared on her tray moments later, set down with just a little too much force. Water sloshed near the rim, but Amara caught the glass before a single drop spilled. Rachel said nothing more. As the plane taxied, Amara's gaze drifted back to the man across the aisle. His eyes met hers again, and this time, there was a flicker of something else. Quiet solidarity. The engines rumbled to life. Amara closed her eyes, letting the hum settle the tension in her chest. She had weathered storms before, but there was always that lingering question. Why must I always brace for them in the first place? The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Rachel returned. Her presence lingered at Amara's side like an unwanted shadow. This time, there was no tray of drinks, no thinly veiled offer meant to reinforce the boundaries of who belonged and who did not. There was only the brittle tension of unspoken words, and Amara could feel them pressing against her like an unwanted weight. "Dr. Sullivan," Rachel began, her forced politeness stretched taut over something colder. "I noticed you didn't pre-select a meal option. Unfortunately, our first-class selections are limited, and I wanted to make sure you understand that." Amara looked up, steady and calm. She knew exactly what Rachel was doing. This wasn't about meal preferences. It was about subtlety, the kind of subtlety that cloaked itself in professionalism but left just enough room to plant a question in the minds of those within earshot. "Thank you," Amara replied. "I understand the policy. I'm fine with whatever is available." Rachel's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, pausing for a fraction longer than necessary. It was a game. The kind of game Amara had played her entire life in lecture halls, boardrooms, and now here at 30,000 feet. The rules were unwritten but universally understood. People like Rachel weren't bold enough to deny her outright. That would be too obvious. Instead, they chipped away quietly, hoping that one day, if they did it long enough, someone like Amara might begin to doubt herself. But Amara had no intention of letting doubt take root. The man across the aisle lowered his newspaper again, his gaze lingering longer this time. He didn't speak, but Amara could feel his silent disapproval, the soft shake of his head as Rachel disappeared down the aisle. It was a small thing, but small things add up. Amara turned back toward the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds stretch beneath the plane. She thought of the board meetings she had sat through, where her ideas had been questioned by men who hadn't read half the research she had authored. She thought of the double takes in corridors, the casual assumption that she must be someone's assistant and not the one delivering the keynote address. Her achievements had never shielded her from it. If anything, they seemed to provoke it further. The clouds outside blurred, and for a moment, she let herself drift. The hum of the engines became a soft lull, pulling her toward rest. But rest was short-lived. Rachel returned barely 20 minutes later. This time she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant, younger with wide eyes and a hesitant smile, trailed a few steps behind her. Amara didn't miss the glance the younger woman cast toward her before quickly lowering her gaze to the floor. "I thought you might like something to celebrate," Rachel said, placing a glass of champagne on Amara's tray. Amara lifted her gaze slowly, meeting Rachel's eyes. "I don't drink," Amara said, her voice calm but firm. Rachel straightened, her lips tightening just slightly. "Oh," she replied, her surprise faint but carefully designed to be visible. "I assumed you might want to make an exception. It's not every day someone sits up here after all." Amara held her gaze, the moment stretching, the silence swelling between them like a tide threatening to break over the edge of the cabin. Rachel didn't move. She was waiting for Amara to accept the glass, to participate in this unspoken ritual of compromise. But Amara didn't reach for it. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, his voice low but deliberate. "If she said no, I believe that's the end of it." Rachel's head snapped toward him, but the weight of his gaze pinned her in place. She said nothing, only smiled tightly and gathered the untouched glass before retreating down the aisle. Amara turned slightly toward the man, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement. "It's exhausting, isn't it?" he said softly, folding his paper. Amara glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. It's been exhausting for a long time. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Some people don't know how to mind their own business. Amara looked back toward the clouds. It's not about business, she said quietly. It's about belief. She doesn't believe I should be here, so she keeps looking for proof that she's right. The man regarded her for a moment before nodding thoughtfully. Well, he said, I hope she's paying attention. Amara exhaled, letting the weight of the exchange roll off her shoulders. She had learned long ago that battles like this didn't end in dramatic confrontations. No, they were slow and insidious, and victory wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was as simple as refusing to yield. The plane flew on, slicing through the clouds. As Amara sat quietly in her seat, she held on to that thought like an anchor. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't a guest in this space. She belonged.